All right, we are going to continue on with photosynthesis today. Cellular respiration was pretty intense. Photosynthesis is still a pretty intense process, especially if we're covering it in just one day. But the one thing that will carry over from cellular respiration to photosynthesis is going to be that idea that hydrogen is getting pumped against its concentration gradient so that it will flow back in through ATP synthase to make ATP. So if you got that concept down, you're good to go. If you don't have that concept down yet, you may want to spend a little time with it or get on a Zoom call with me so we can go through it, especially those of you that are going to move on to AP Bio at some point. All right, so just to get us started off. So in 1995, filmmakers from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics approached some new graduates from Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And one of the questions they posed was, here's a seed. Imagine I planted that seed in the ground and a tree grew. And over here they show you what's called the president, a giant sequoia in California. It is 3,200 years old. Can you imagine? I mean, that's cool to see a tree that is over 3,000 years old and it is huge, like super huge. And so the question is, if you put a seed in the ground, where does all the weight come from? Where does that mass come from? Where does all that matter come from? And our answer is obviously what our topic is today, and it's photosynthesis. And so let's talk about what an autotroph is. So a heterotroph is what you and I are. We get our energy from other living organisms. An autotroph consists of plants, algae, and some bacteria that have the ability to use sunlight to generate their own storage molecules of energy. It is also believed that there's a certain type of slug that does photosynthesis, but the slug is going to contain photosynthetic pigments and stuff like that, but it has been determined that there really are no animals that really do photosynthesis. They appear to, but they actually don't really do it. They're actually autotrophs. So organisms that get their energy from sunlight are called photoautotrophs. Photo meaning light and auto meaning self-feeding, troph meaning nutrition. They're photoautotrophs. So this is called the willow tree experiment. The basic knowledge that plants need water, sunlight, and soil has been around since ancient times. And the working hypothesis was that plants grew by eating soil through their roots. So that's what they once believed, that they're eating soil through the roots. And that would kind of make sense. Like, okay, that makes sense. They're sucking food up from the roots. But Jean-Baptiste von Helmont wanted to verify this and to isolate the exact source of the increase of mass of trees as they grew. So the hypothesis is plants are eating soil. So the willow tree experiment was when this guy planted a 5-pound willow tree in 200 pounds of dry potted soil. So if the hypothesis was true, the plant would not be able to grow over 200 they would not be able to grow 200 more pounds. But it says he massed the tree, grew it for 5 years, then massed it and the soil again. And he found that the tree gained over 160 pounds of mass, and the soil had only decreased by 2 ounces. What? That's crazy. Where did all the mass come from? All right, so according to the law of conservation of mass, mass cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. So where then does the dry mass of wood come from? So this is the law of conservation of mass. Matter cannot be created or destroyed. Mass cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. So where did that mass come from? So it's part of the mystery of how plants worked was due to the lack of understanding of air. And so for many centuries, scientists believed that air was a pure elementary substance. And this stemmed from the Greek philosopher Aristotle's idea of all matter being composed of 4 elements: earth, fire, wind, and water. But then this guy, he's a British chemist, he came along. His name is Joseph Priestley. And he believed that air was not a single elementary substance, but a composition of gases. So in one experiment, he discovered that a candle placed in a sealed jar would extinguish very quickly. He called the air injured because it was unable to support fire. Placing a mouse in the jar would have a similar effect and it would die. So if you put a candle in a jar, pretty soon the flame would go out. Also, the mouse would die. He had discovered oxygen because in order for something to burn, it needs oxygen. And in order for the mouse to live, it also needs oxygen. So Priestley's hypothesis about the composition of air was correct. So what was his hypothesis? What did he say? Sorry. He said that it was a composition. Sorry, I had to, it took me a minute to find it. He said that air was not a single elementary substance, was a composition of gases. Air, meaning all the air around us, was not a pure elementary substance. It's a composition of different gases. Okay, so what is the composition of air? It's made out of 78% nitrogen. 78%. That's like most of the air around us is nitrogen. We don't usually think about that, right? We usually think it's pure oxygen that I'm breathing in and it's pure carbon dioxide that I'm breathing out. If the air around you was pure oxygen, we definitely would have caught on fire by now because pure oxygen is actually very explosive. That's why people who I tell a story about how I actually experienced seeing a car blow up because a person with an oxygen tank lit a cigarette. But that's why people who have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and it's a result of smoking, if they have an oxygen tank and then they smoke again, they are risking a major explosion and fire. So anyways, oxygen is very explosive and flammable. 1% of the air is oxygen, 0.9% is argon, 0.03% is carbon dioxide, 0.02% is water. All right. So get those down. So nitrogen would be N2. It's a diatomic. It has to come in pairs. If you haven't taken chemistry, you'll learn about that. Oxygen is also a diatomic. It comes in pairs, so it's only written O2. Oxygen will never be by itself as O. Argon is A, R. Big A, little r. Carbon dioxide is CO2, and water is H2O. Or you can write the words if you want to. All right, Ingenhouse's experiment. A Dutch physician, Jan Ingenhouse, decided to repeat Priestley's experiment with a few changes. 2 sealed containers were studied. One was exposed to sunlight and the other was left in the shade. The sunlit container showed an increase in oxygen compared to the shaded one. So there is some way, somehow, direct correlation. The more sunlight there is, the more oxygen is going to be given off. So plants must be releasing oxygen. All right, so here's the final puzzle piece. Swiss botanist named Nicholas, and I'm going to butcher this name, de Saussure. I don't know, maybe I did say that right. He enclosed the plants in a sealed container of carbon dioxide and compared the air and plant masses before and after growth. Based on these measurements, he concluded that plants were primarily composed of water from the soil, carbon from the air, and the process was called photosynthesis. So there's something kind of that must be missing in this slide, and I apologize. What he found was if he did the same thing. He put one in sunlight, one in the shade, and he put a bunch of carbon dioxide and found that they gained more mass if they had carbon dioxide and sunlight. Okay, so what he's determining here is that plants are going to need carbon dioxide and sunlight in order to grow the most. And it was concluded that this process was called photosynthesis. They are using water, plants are using water from the soil, carbon from the air, and sunlight in order to synthesize plant tissue. All right. So thank goodness all these scientists had the time to do this because we just kind of take it for granted. We're like, yeah, photosynthesis, it happens. Well, they didn't know that at one point. So the concept of photosynthesis was difficult to understand because the idea of producing a heavy plant from air and water is not intuitive. Like it's just not intuitive. It just is like, wait, what? Because you can't like touch sunlight, right? And it's hard. You can't like touch air. You can touch water, but if it's not like a tangible thing, like a human eats a sandwich and then they get bigger, like that's intuitive. But something getting bigger from air and sunlight, it's just not something that you naturally think of. So converting the matter in air and water to plants requires a great deal of energy. Great deal of energy. So where does that energy come from? Let's talk about energy. There's many different forms of energy in the universe. So I talked a little bit about yesterday about potential energy and kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy and exists as a result of position or chemical structure. So you can think of potential energy. I use the example with cellular respiration. If you climb up the ladder, if you climb up any ladder, but I'm talking about a ladder that has a diving board, climb up a ladder to a diving board, you are gaining potential energy as you move upward, right? You're gaining the potential of something to happen. And that happening, the thing that could happen is you falling to the ground because of gravity. All right. The same thing exists when you have a big molecular compound. So glucose, C6H12O6, has more potential energy than just carbon dioxide, CO2, because it has more bonds. So the more bonds a compound has, the more potential energy. Because what's the potential? The potential is that those bonds can break and release energy. Kinetic energy is energy in motion. So if I climb up to the diving board, I'm gaining potential energy. As I fall down, I'm basically, that's kinetic energy. Same thing with a molecule of glucose. The more bonds that are formed, the more potential energy is formed. And then as the bonds break, that's kinetic energy. So they're like go back and forth. Okay. The electromagnetic spectrum. Kinetic energy is going to travel in the form of waves. So each type of energy has its own wavelength. And you look here at the electromagnetic spectrum: radio, microwave, infrared, visible, ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma. Visible light is right here in the middle. All right. And this is telling you what the relative size, what about the size of radio waves are like the size of buildings. Microwaves are the size of humans. Infrared, somewhere between microwave and you can see the picture right here, okay? And as the wavelength gets smaller, obviously the comparison gets smaller. So I think you get the point of that. Visible light, though, is what we are talking about when we talk about photosynthesis. So most of the energy that supports life on Earth originates from the sun. So that's going to be visible light right here in the middle. Solar radiation primarily contains three ranges of wavelengths of energy. Visible light, which we're able to detect. That's why it's called visible light. And so if you remember Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. That's the visible light spectrum. And that's what we're able to see, unless you're colorblind. And then ultraviolet light, or ultraviolet energy, has shorter wavelengths than visible light, and it's actually able to penetrate living tissue. So UV light is what we worry about, penetrating living tissue, causing DNA mutations, and ultimately, if enough DNA mutations collect, that ends up causing cancer. But what we're more concerned with photosynthesis is visible light and the visible light spectrum. The sun can also give off infrared or heat, which has a longer wavelength than visible light. All right, so that's just a little bit about the like solar energy. It can have these three, but we're only worried about this. So I'd circle visible light. That's what we're worried about when we are discussing photosynthesis. So plants can harness some wavelengths of visible light. So this is what I was talking about. There are some wavelengths of visible light that can be harnessed and can be used to convert matter in the air to that of their own tissues. So what they do, photosynthesis in a nutshell, is taking the hydrogens from water and the carbon and oxygen from carbon dioxide using sunlight to rearrange bonds to make sugar. That's all it is. Take the hydrogens from water, take the carbons and oxygens from carbon dioxide, use light to rearrange bonds to make sugar. That's all it is. This is such a pretty picture. I love this. The primary location of photosynthesis is in the leaves. Cells within the leaves have a high concentration of chloroplasts. So remember our discussion of cells, what chloroplasts are. They're usually green because they have a green pigment called chlorophyll. So if something is showing the color green, is it absorbing green wavelength or is it reflecting the green wavelength from the visible light spectrum? So remember, visible light spectrum is Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So if it's showing the color green, it's not absorbing green, it's reflecting green. So it's kind of funny when you think about plants, they're showing green, but that's like the one part of visible light that they're definitely not using. I think that's what's kind of funny about it. I don't know if y'all find that funny or not, but I do. All right, endosymbiosis. We talked a little bit about this already, so I'm going to discuss the chloroplast. And there should have been a picture. On your paper, you have a chloroplast. Sorry, I'm going back. So I have this picture on the slide, but on your paper, you have a chloroplast. This picture is just a bunch of plant cells. But if you zoomed in, you would see the actual organelle. And so it's really important to take note of this organelle that's found inside a plant cell. Cells within leaves have high concentration of chloroplasts, each of which contain a green pigment called chlorophyll. I wanted to make sure I pointed that out because I could go back and I could copy and paste, but I think you guys can see. I'm showing you the picture of plant cells. If you zoomed into the plant cell, you would see the organelle of a chloroplast. And those are the parts of the chloroplast. It's double membraned. It has these stacks. They're called thylakoid discs. And that is where photosynthesis takes place. All right, so we talked about endosymbiosis and the endosymbiosis theory or endosymbiotic theory and what's important about chloroplasts and mitochondria. And so I just want to bring this up one more time. When we talk about chloroplasts, it's really, really important to make sure you note that they're double membraned, they have their own ribosomes, they have their own DNA, and they can self-replicate. Therefore, it is believed that they were once their own prokaryote-like organism, and at some point a eukaryote-like ancestor engulfed one, and they formed a symbiotic relationship. And the photosynthetic prokaryote was believed to be called a cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are bacteria cells that are actually green. It's bacteria that can do photosynthesis. So it's believed a eukaryote-like organism engulfed like a cyanobacteria and it became a plant cell. I mean, that's like really a simplistic explanation for something that's very, very complicated. And we don't have nobody was there, like nobody was there to like have a camera up and record this happening or anything because humans didn't exist. But it just seems logical, I guess, is what scientists are thinking. It seems logical that cyanobacteria were actually the first photosynthetic cells. They still exist today, but it's believed that at some point a eukaryote-like ancestor engulfed one and became a plant cell. I mean, that's a pretty cool story if it's true. All right, so let's actually get into the process of photosynthesis. The reactants of photosynthesis, and here's what's really cool about cellular respiration and photosynthesis is if you memorize the formula for cellular respiration, then you already have the formula for photosynthesis memorized because it just goes backwards. So the reactants of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. And the products are, so carbon dioxide, water, I would add sunlight. So I'd draw a picture of a sun right there, if you can do that. I'm doing it with my cursor. Draw a picture of the sun. All right, and then the products actually are sugar and oxygen. Every once in a while, someone will put water in as one of the products. Okay, fine. That's fine. But most of the time, you're only going to see sugar and oxygen listed as one of the products. So carbon dioxide and water are used to synthesize glucose. Oxygen is given off as a waste. Make sure you don't need to write anything down. Nope. As long as it says oxygen is produced as a waste. Perfect. So if you were to write actual chemical reaction, you would write CO2 plus H2O plus sunlight yields, with an arrow sign, glucose and oxygen. Ooh, whoa. I know you're looking at this picture and you're like, oh my God. Okay. It's kind of complicated. It's actually very complicated. Um, at no point in time would you have to have like a diagram like this completely memorized. I would expect for you to really, for photosynthesis, to just be really familiar with the formula at this point. But I am going to go through all of the steps. So the first part of photosynthesis, it has two stages. So remember, cellular respiration has three stages. Photosynthesis has two. The first stage is called the light reaction, and it's called the light-dependent reaction because it can only occur when sunlight is available. Only occurs when sunlight is available, so it's called light-dependent. So this membrane right here, this isn't the cell membrane, this is the membrane of the chloroplast, so I would definitely note that. This is the membrane that's inside, sorry, this is the thylakoid membrane. So it's inside of the chloroplast, it's the thylakoid membrane. If you look back at your picture of your chloroplast on the previous page, the thylakoid are these little discs-like structures inside of the chloroplast that are stacked on each other. So this is the thylakoid membrane. And these little bell pepper looking things, I just think they look like purple bell peppers. Purple bell peppers don't exist, but if they did, this is what they would look like. They're embedded in the thylakoid membrane, and they contain chloroplast. These little green things are your chloroplast, okay? So, what is happening? Step one, light, and we can get real fancy and say it's a photon. It's just a light particle. A light particle strikes the purple bell pepper known as photosystem 2. Why does photosystem 2 come before photosystem 1? Because photosystem 1 was discovered first, then they discovered photosystem 2. And then they just kept it like that to just confuse us. It's so annoying. But the first part of the light reaction actually involves photosystem 2. Light strikes photosystem 2, causing electrons in the chlorophyll to get excited. The excitement of the electrons splits water. This is where oxygen is given off as a waste, and what is kept are the hydrogens. So if you haven't figured out how important hydrogen is for the production of energy, just take my word for it now. Hydrogen is so important. And it's kind of funny when I tell people, when you eat butter, what is causing that butter to be so fattening and full of energy are just the hydrogens. Because some poor little hydrogen is sitting up there on the periodic table. So if you can picture the periodic table, it's on the upper left side. It's like all by itself, poor thing. It's like the smallest one. It has one proton. Hydrogen is probably one of the most important elements. I mean, they're all important, but I just love hydrogen. It's one of my favorites. So it's causing the splitting of water right here. Oxygen is given off as a waste. Hydrogen is kept, and we're going to do something, or well, the plant's going to do something with hydrogen. Okay, so that's happened. The electrons that get taken from water are passed down an electron transport chain. This should sound familiar. And it's going to be the same thing that was happening before, where hydrogens get pumped out against their concentration gradient. They come back in and they form ATP through ATP synthase, just like before. All right? If you're completely confused at this point, that's okay. That's normal. I'm going to go back over the steps in just a minute. This is hard, y'all. This is really difficult. The AP students have a hard time with this too. When I was in college, I had a hard time with this too. It's difficult. So once the electrons get down at the bottom of this electron transport chain, light hits a photon, a light particle hits photosystem 1. So it's kind of like a repeat of what we saw over here. Light hits, electrons get excited, and this is showing the jumping of electrons around, and then they jump up right here. They go down another electron transport chain. NADP plus comes in, picks up electrons, combines with a hydrogen to become NADPH. That should look a little bit familiar because remember in cellular respiration, you had NAD plus and FAD plus. They came in and picked up hydrogens and electrons. So these are just like I explained them, they're like your little Ubers. They really don't do anything but just transport electrons and hydrogens over to the next phase. All right, and the next phase is called the Calvin cycle. So before I talk a little bit about the electron transport chain, I just want to make a little note here, and it's written down. The chlorophyll that's found in photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 is referred to as P680 and P700. The reason why they're given that name is because they respond best to light at wavelength 680 and 700, and that's red. So all I really need you to know right here is that the chlorophyll is going to absorb red and is going to reflect green. And then we go into a little bit more detail. We're kind of going back to this part right here. Kind of like I'd said, it's the same thing that's happening in cellular respiration, that the hydrogen ions that came from water are used to generate ATP through the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, very similar to what happened during cellular respiration. And so ATP synthase is going to be used for that again. All right. So how can we summarize this? I'm going to give you a really simple summary because this is overwhelming. And I know, and I'm not the only one that gives this diagram in cell biology. The other two teachers do it too. But really, you need to know the formula for photosynthesis, and then you need to know what is accomplished here. So sunlight and water are used. So I would write that down. Sunlight and water are used to make ATP and NADPH. That's really our summary. Sunlight and water are used to make ATP and NADPH. ATP and NADPH are then used for the Calvin cycle. I would write that down too. If you didn't get that, you're going to need to pause and rewind. All right, let's move on to what's called the light-independent reaction. The light-independent reaction is also known as the Calvin cycle. So ATP and NADPH are then used by the light-independent reaction to generate glucose. So we need a source of carbon. We have ATP, we have NADPH. So we have our energy to form bonds, and we have our hydrogens. We got to have our carbons and oxygens. And where does that carbon and oxygen come from? It comes from CO2. CO2 comes from the air, and the plant needs to take in CO2 through these little pores, they're little holes on the underside of the leaf called stomata. Stomata are going to open and close, and they're going to bring in carbon dioxide. All right. And so if we were to look under the microscope and really take an imprint of a underside of a leaf, we'd be able to see these little pores right here called stomata. All right. So I want to just make sure I'm not going too fast here. The ATP and I'm repeating myself, the ATP and NADPH that were formed during the light reaction are going to be used to make sugar, but we've got to have a source of carbon. And we get the source of carbon, well, the plant is going to need a source of carbon. The plant is going to bring carbon dioxide in through these tiny pores on the other side of the leaves called stomata. And then we have the Calvin cycle. So we've got ATP, NADPH, carbon dioxide, a series of steps where ATP forms bonds, NADPH drops off hydrogens and electrons, and you make sugar. So something that would be important to know, I want to see if we talk about Rubisco, we do. All right, something that's important to know is that 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are used to make a sugar called G3P. And you're filling in your blanks for this. It's called G3P. That's what the sugar is called, is just G3P. And then you have 2 G3Ps that make glucose. I wouldn't get caught up on that detail at this point. I would just know carbon dioxide is going to be brought into the Calvin cycle. ATP forms bonds, NADPH drops off hydrogens. You end up with a sugar. And then there's a regeneration that happens and the cycle just keeps repeating itself. Okay, so the energy within ATP and then the hydrogens that are dropped off from NADPH are used to power the Calvin cycle to make sugar. The enzyme that is responsible for getting the Calvin cycle started is called Rubisco. So I would just know there's an enzyme that's really important for the Calvin cycle, and it's called Rubisco. Rubisco is the most abundant enzyme on Earth. It's really, I always remember that. I don't know if you guys remember, okay, Matt Leonard and Kobe Vo. I think Matt Leonard did it. Yes, he did. They were on like in the Science Bowl, and I remember them telling me at one point they won the Science Bowl, and I may be totally making up this story in my head, but I know there was something that had to do with this in the Science Bowl. The last question was, what is the most abundant enzyme on Earth? And apparently Kobe either knew it or didn't know it. I'm pretty sure he knew it. That's the story that I'm going to stick to. Kobe knew that Rubisco was the most abundant enzyme on Earth, and they won. So every time I see Rubisco, I think about Kobe Bo. Aww. All right, so sometimes Rubisco is referred to as the bridge or the gateway to life because carbon dioxide is considered a lifeless molecule until Rubisco. So Rubisco is working right here. And it's going to help bring carbon dioxide in and it fixes it into the cycle. So Rubisco is important for the Calvin cycle. All right. So what could be our summary for the Calvin cycle? Summary for the Calvin cycle is carbon dioxide, with the help of Rubisco, enters into a cycle where ATP and NADPH converted into sugar. I'll repeat that. Carbon dioxide, with the help of Rubisco, enters into a cycle where ATP and NADPH converted into sugar. I feel like that's manageable. I really do. I'm going to move on. All right, let's talk about color a little bit, and then, hey, we're getting there. We're getting there. This one's going to be a 40-minute one, but we're getting there. Plants have multiple pigments in their leaves besides chlorophyll to help absorb the energy from visible light. But collectively, these pigments are able to absorb most wavelengths of visible light. They utilize all wavelengths that are not green. And I already said this, so this isn't new information. So if you look at this chart right here, there's different pigments besides chlorophyll A. Chlorophyll A is the one we normally are referring to, but there's also chlorophyll B and there's carotenoids. And you can see that most wavelengths are going to be absorbed to a certain extent, except for green. It's so low on the green one, and I don't know why. Like, why is it the really short ones and the really long ones? And I don't think that's something that anyone has a good answer for. It could be that it's just an intermediate. But yeah, the really short ones, the blue and the red, is what's going to be used most. So yeah, I'd already said that plants are going to reflect green, and then I'm skipping this slide. I don't want you to know that. I'm going to talk a little bit about plant adaptations. So if you have a plant that is, actually I want to do this one. If you have plants like pineapple that are in really hot places, they're going to risk dehydration. So remember, in order to bring CO2 in to do photosynthesis, the stomata have to open during the day. Well, that means that the plant's going to risk dehydration because water will leave through the stomata. So these plants have evolved to have an adaptation where the stomata is open at night and closed during the day. With other plants, like if you walk outside, the plants outside here, the stomata are going to be open during the day and closed at night. But if you go to a place where there's pineapple, cactus, and stuff like that, these are called cam plants. Cam plants are going to have stomata closed during the day, open at night. So what they do is they bring carbon dioxide in at night as opposed to during the daytime, and they store it, as an organic acid. And so CAM stands for crassylation acid metabolism. So they store carbon dioxide as an acid at night. So then during the daytime, it's already there. It's like they bring it in and they save it. Well, then the sun comes up, they close their stomata, and then they use the carbon dioxide. It's just bringing it in at a different time. It gets used at the same time whenever the sun's out, but they just bring it in at night, which is pretty cool. All right, let's talk a little bit about the products of photosynthesis. So the end result of the glucose produced by photosynthesis depends on the needs of the plant. If the plant needs to grow, the glucose will be used to generate the polysaccharide cellulose. We've talked about that one. If there's excess glucose, then it will be stored as starch. So remember, cellulose they're both made up of glucose. They both have that in common. They're both made of glucose. It's the way the glucose is bonded together. So cellulose is going to be in chains, and cellulose is going to make up the structure of the plant. Starch is going to be in branches, and that is going to just be used for storage. So remember the opposite, or not the opposite necessarily, but in animals, we don't store glucose as starch, we store it as glycogen. And it just has a little bit of a different branching pattern. So that's the fate of the glucose that gets made. Potatoes and other plants have specialized storage organelles called amyloplasts that produce and store starch. So this is why if I put iodine on potato, what will happen? It's going to turn a blue-black color, like a really dark blue, almost purpley, but it looks black. So that's just kind of cool that potatoes are going to have these organelles called amyloplasts that you're not going to find in other parts of the plant. Okay, and so really, really important. Last thing I want to say, this is a major misconception that occurs with students because when biology teachers teach cellular respiration, they talk about animal cells. And then when biology teachers teach photosynthesis, they talk about plant cells. So students will leave the class believing plants do photosynthesis and not cellular respiration, but that's not true. So I want you to put a big star on your paper, and I want you to write plants do both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. This is their eating. This is their making energy from the food. Kind of like we eat and we make energy from the food we eat. So just please remember that plants do both. And I think that is all that we have on our paper. This allows them to process glucose into ATP when plant cells are in need of chemical energy. So they do both because plants need ATP too. All right, hopefully that wasn't too painful. We are going to move on to DNA, which I think find a lot more interesting than cellular respiration and photosynthesis. But this is important because obviously this is going to determine how we make energy and how food gets grown and all of that great stuff. But that is photosynthesis, and that's a wrap for today. You are going to do a virtual photosynthesis lab, and that will have been explained in the Zoom, so I will talk to you guys later.